Good evening and welcome everyone to this meeting of the Corporate Policy Development Committee. I am Councillor George Courtauld and I'm chairman of this committee. We will now go through a few items of housekeeping. We're not expecting a fire alarm this evening, but should one sound, please can members use the exit to the rear of the chamber and assemble in the car park. Please can you make sure that your telephones and devices are switched to silent. Sorry about that. If members wish to speak during our debates this evening, please can you indicate by raising your hand and I'll come to you at the appropriate time. Please can I remind everyone to use their microphones when speaking and switch them off when they finish speaking. This meeting is also being webcasted. I will now proceed with the main business of the meeting. Agenda item number 1, apologies for absence. We have received apologies from the following members: Councillor Jim Bond, Councillor John Hayes and Councillor Mark Alt. Are there any further apologies?
We're not aware of any further apologies, thank you, Chair.
I will now proceed then with agenda item 2, declarations of interest. Do members have any disclosable pecuniary interest, other registrable interest or non-registrable interest that they wish to declare this evening? Please state the item and the nature of your interest if you do. As there are no declarations, I will proceed to item 3, minutes of the previous meeting. Members were asked to approve the minutes of the meeting which took place on the 4th December 2024. Please can I have a proposer to approve the minutes? Councillor Ravage, thank you. Please can I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Williams. All those in favour? Thank you, members. The minutes are approved. I will now initial and sign the minutes. Thank you. I will now proceed with agenda item 4, public question time. Members, as we have no registered speakers for this evening's meeting, I will proceed with the next item of business, which is agenda item 5, scrutiny review into anti-social behaviour, the third evidence gathering session. Members, this is the third evidence gathering session of the committee in respect of its scrutiny review into anti-social behaviour. I'm pleased to advise that Jo Stock, Anti-Social Behaviour Project Review Manager, is in attendance this evening to talk about her work in respect of ASB. Joining Jo is Charlotte Payne, Head of Operations, and Caroline Elias-Stevenson, Head of our Housing and Communities. Welcome to you all. We're grateful for your assistance with our review. To support members' evidence gathering this evening, an accompanying report was prepared by officers and circulated to the committee on Thursday last week. The report provides members with some background information on the Council's statutory obligations in relation to policies and procedures and reporting and recording of ASB. Please bear this information in mind when asking the officers your questions following the presentation this evening. Jo, please can I ask you to begin with your presentation?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good evening. Am I on? Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good evening, committee. My name is Jo Stock, and as Mr. Chairman said, my role is to conduct a service review, an officer-led service review of the ASB delivery service within Braintree. The scope of my review was to cover staffing structures, resources within teams, baseline statistical data, policy and procedure, and the use of legislation. It's the last of these 2 points that we will discuss tonight, with focus on the scrutiny review terms of reference points D and E, relating to policy and procedure, and I will happily take questions after this presentation. However, before I begin, I must wrap a caveat around what we're going to talk about tonight, because yesterday the government published their Crime and Policing Bill 2025, has significant consequences to ASB service delivery for all of us. Significant changes will be the introduction of new powers, changes to the existing service delivery model, the legislative framework that we're working towards and to now, There will also be data reporting requirements brought in. There will be statutory function. There will be data that's supplied from the local authority into the Home Office. Once it's taken its time to go through the judicial process and becomes enacted, it will then become the burden of this council to make those changes within its service delivery model so it satisfies the new legislation. Keep that in mind while we talk about what we're going to talk about tonight, because this is just a moment in time for those changes that are set to come. Now, the previous sessions of this committee have already heard from operational officers as to the legal framework in which those officers operate, the type of request for service they receive, and how they approach those requests. I do not intend to revisit those evidence gathering sessions from before, but I will provide the committee with a recap of the legislative framework and the staffing structure that exists currently within the council. The definition of ASB is long established. It comes from the 2014 Anti-Social Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act, and it is conduct that has caused or is likely to cause harassment, alarm or distress. In a housing setting, it's conduct that's capable of causing nuisance or annoyance. Further to this definition are three categories of ASB. We've got personal, environmental and nuisance. They are non-statutory. Personal affects a group or an individual. It's intimidation, it's harassment, it's abuse. Environmental affects public spaces, environmental cleanliness, abandoned vehicles. And nuisance affects a community, noise, rowdy behaviour, public drunkenness. However, rigid categorisation of ASB into offences such as those causes confusion for the public. So interpretation and your interpretation of those categories should remain flexible. The ASB service is currently delivered across three service areas. Housing and Communities is responsible for community safety, the Braintree and District Community Safety Partnership and housing related issues. Operations is responsible for street scene enforcement, and Environment is responsible for environmental health. The committee will recall ASB enforcement is dealt with by the street scene enforcement team and environmental health team, and you'll also remember these teams are not exclusive to ASB service delivery. When officers are investigating complaints of ASB and considering appropriate enforcement action, they must have due regard to statutory guidance. The guidance derives from the 2014 Act. It provides the officers with the legal test that they must satisfy before they use their powers. And it also provides guidance on the formal case review process that is through the Community Safety Partnership. Additionally to this, legislation also provides for the publication of statutory documents. These too come from the Community Safety Partnership. We've got a strategic assessment, we've got an annual action plan, and then following those two documents is an annual report. So the strategic assessment is the document that holds all the data, the crime data, across the district. It forms the action plan. The action plan is what officers will set out to achieve to reduce crime and antisocial behaviour in your district. The annual report is then the report that tells you, when you scrutinise it as a scrutiny committee, how the officers have performed in relation to the priorities that they set. Locally, the council has published an ASB protocol. Whilst this isn't a policy document in itself, it does set out a broad approach as to how the council will receive and handle complaints of ASB and provide service users with an outline of the service they can expect when they make a complaint to the council. The protocol was issued in 2020. Since then, the statutory guidance has been updated, and we have the upcoming legislative changes we've spoken about already coming, and we must consider a review of the protocol to ensure the council has robust policies in place in light of the statutory guidance which has changed and the upcoming legislative changes. Internally, officers have a ASB process flow document. In the broadest terms, this is how the incident journey is mapped through the council. So once it's received into the council, it demonstrates which team will approach the investigation. And finally, although not a council document, the CSP, the Community Safety Partnership, applies the Essex ASB case review guidance document when it's undertaking case reviews. The document was last reviewed in 2014 on the date it was issued. I understand it's now undergoing review from the county-wide strategic group. The service review, the officer-led service review, did not find any non-compliance with either a statutory requirement to publish documents nor any non-compliance with any internal procedure. The officers are able to demonstrate actions taken and decisions made through their use of the case management system. However, determining the council performance based on available statistical data is rather more opaque. Operational officers regularly and consistently record incident data. It goes on to the case management system. They provide monthly incident count data to senior management for consideration at their meetings. Now, whilst this data provides indicators of compliance with procedures, such as providing timeframes, we're able to demonstrate when a complaint came in, when it was dealt with. Beyond the basic count data provided by the case management system, more in-depth data is not easily extracted, and therefore it does not provide us with helpful measures to assess demand and performance. But not wishing to be statistically empty-handed for you tonight, I asked our Street Scene Enforcement Assistant Manager Stuart Thompson to collate statistics from the last quarter for his team. It's the Street Scene Enforcement team who handle the majority of ASB cases. So, in November, Stuart's team received a total of 70 requests. Of these, 7 were ASB related. December, 118 requests, 24 ASB related. And January, 80 requests, 8 were ASB related. In addition to dealing with complaints, the Street Scene Enforcement team also undertake patrols around the Braintree Town Centre regarding the PSPO. They visit the rough sleepers in tents and patrols with Essex Police. In respect of the PSPO, I'm told that 7 fixed penalty notices have been issued, and these have all been issued by the police since the inception of the PSPO. Case review statistics for 24-25, the number of applications for a case review received by the council is 10. Of those 10, 5 have been accepted. Beg your pardon, 3 have been accepted, 5 were declined, they didn't meet the threshold, and 3 are currently going through. Whilst the upcoming changes to reporting requirements we spoke about earlier, there will be the requirement for the ability to collect and analyse data in a rigorous way. It's important, therefore, to ensure that any case management system that the officers are using is fit for purpose for recording data, and it's required that offences are appropriately identified and recorded correctly. This will enable extraction of valuable data to satisfy whatever new reporting restrictions are coming in. Therefore, in conclusion, the service review recommends a review of the protocol and processes to ensure future policies and procedures are robust, up-to-date, clear and transparent, and the opportunities are explored for enhanced data collection and analysis. So I thank you, committee members, for your attention, and if I'm able, I will gladly answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Jo. Any questions? Councillor Garrard.
Thank you. Have you looked at the new legislation that was going forward at all? that has just come out, and have you seen anything that jumps out that may cause major difficulties? I've been looking on the ASB Help website, which is a charity that helps people, and they've been quite looking forward to some changes taking place. Do you have any comments about that at all?
The changes are long awaited. They started with the previous government, and the election stopped the legislation going through. So we have waited some time for this. Initially, there were going to be, and it only came out yesterday afternoon. So off the top of my head, we've got 2 new orders coming in. We've got respect orders and we've got youth injunction orders, which allows for an injunction for an under 18. There are changes coming to fixed penalty notices. So I believe the financial penalty is being increased from £100 to £500 for breach of a community penalty notice and for breach of a PSPO. There's also an extension of powers so that the registered providers can serve notices. So this would be foreclosure notices. And there's something else as well that I can't quite put my finger on at the minute.
Councillor Ramage.
Thank you for the presentation, Joe. With regards to antisocial behaviour, do you find they are sort of in a fairly similar area every time these happen? I mean, obviously housing is not so much, but if it's on the streets, say, is it sort of town centres, you know, where there's pubs and things like that? And I think you've got this bus that goes around as well, which is that something to do with trying to keep that sort of level of anti-because I mean I'm Witham councillor, and we have had a few issues in Witham over the last year which didn't always used to be the case, so I'm just wondering how this is coming about as such, and you know, and have you looked into why these antisocial behaviour things are happening? Thank you.
Me to respond to that one. So I couldn't give you a categorical answer on what the hotspots of locations. They do move around. So, for example, we've identified that there was an issue within the Braintree Town Centre, hence the reason for the public space protection order. We use police data and we look at that through the strategic assessment annually, and work with the police to identify hotspots and locations. And I think that it's probably fair to say that there isn't one location that's identified more than another. It depends on the type of antisocial behaviour that we're looking at. So, for example, the public space protection order in the Braintree Town Centre is to address a number of different issues, including alcohol-related antisocial behaviour. So that's something that's been identified there. But antisocial behaviour, as you say, in terms of housing, can be in different communities and different housing estates, and it can be very different. It can be nuisance. So I think you talked about the 3 different types of antisocial behaviour. I can do a little bit of mapping, but we do tend to do that on an annual basis with the police through the strategic assessment.
I mean, you tend to relate to antisocial behaviour with drinking, drugs, that sort of thing. Do you find that is the main reason for the antisocial behaviour, or is there other reasons?
So I think that probably the more high-profile antisocial behaviour, I think it's fair to say, could be linked with some of those causes. But I don't think we can say that it's all related to that. So it may be drinking, it may be noise nuisance. So our environmental team deal with a lot of the noise nuisance side of things. There can be a number of things that are categorised as antisocial behaviour. So I think probably it's fair to say more of the high-profile kind of hotspots that may be more linked with drugs and alcohol, but that's not always the case.
Just one other question I thought of. When you go out to deal with these antisocial behaviour events, do you have the police always in support, or do you actually just have the environmental officer going out?
That was a swift look my way. I think there's not always, but there is some really good partnership working. So our street scene enforcement officers will patrol on their own, but where there are specific reasons, or I think they have a routine in which they go and patrol together, which I think is also really good and is often advertised. We like to put it on social media to show that partnership working.
Councillor Raju.
Hello, Joe. Thank you for that. You mentioned that sometimes some of the ASBs are rejected because of they don't meet the threshold. So what is the threshold like? I just want to know why they didn't meet the threshold and what is it?
And that is the problem with ASB, because ASB isn't defined. It is, the definition is behaviour causing or likely to cause harassment, alarm or distress. The threshold is the effect that it has on the victim.
Okay.
So it's how the victim feels with the behaviour. So each victim is, beg your pardon, each victim is individual. So what might affect one person may not affect another. So we can't put names to the offences as such. So we can't categorise them in that way, because what might affect me may not affect you.
Yeah.
So we have to do it from a risk matrix point of view. So when the behaviour comes in, is it ASB?
Yeah.
Is it having a persistent and detrimental effect on the victim? Or is it behaviour so bad that it is actually criminal behaviour, in which case it would be a matter for the police?
Yeah.
So there is a triaging element that comes into this, that for every complaint that comes in,
Sure.
it has to be assessed.
Sure.
Could I just add to that?
Yeah, sure. Please.
Just to add to that, I think that the cases that Joe alluded to that perhaps haven't met the threshold also were in relation to the case reviews, which there's a policy that goes across Essex, and that's where a victim has asked for a case to be reconsidered. So those cases in particular aren't specifically, they do have a kind of criteria that's looked at before they can go on to that next stage. But as Joe says, you know, in terms of any antisocial behaviour case, it is around the feeling and the impact on the victim.
Yeah, because we, unfortunately, we have been victims to antisocial behaviour. We've had to go through these things, but then they said, well, it didn't meet the threshold, and they just sent us a letter of apology. This happened to you, and we're sorry, but we can't do anything. So that's why I just wanted to know, and that literally clicked. Sorry, I've just one more quick question. So when youth are involved with antisocial behavior, how do you deal with it, especially when they are children who are 14, 13, they're out there kicking doors, chucking things at windows of elderly people, throwing eggs. How do we deal and how do we stop that kind of behavior? Because that's something is on a rise right now, where I have seen children buy eggs and take them and literally go home, and it's on the community page. Our house, our windows have been egged. So how is that dealt with?
It's dealt with a variety of resources. So it very much depends. So the emphasis that we give to the victim, we should also give to the perpetrator, and understand the behaviours that are perpetrating those offences, for want of a better word. So there's an element of prevention and intervention that comes within that statutory guidance that must be provided before we go down any criminal sanctions, before we criminalise these 14 or 15-year-olds, which will affect the rest of their lives.
Absolutely.
So prevention and intervention is a big part of the ASB model, and it's the part that sits within the community safety area. It's housing and communities that deal with that. So there's two elements to it. So we've got that part, we can catch these offenders, perpetrators, before that behaviour escalates and stop it happening. That, as I say, sits with community safety. But we've also got the parts where we know these offences have taken place and they have been caught and they are responsible for them. And then there's a decision to be made within that framework as to whether early intervention to prevent that behaviour escalating into more serious crime takes place. So it's a very broad approach that you have to apply to ASB, which makes it a very thorny issue to get a grip of. But again, it comes back to if that behaviour goes past the point of antisocial behaviour and is criminal and is causing criminal damage, in some of the examples you've given, then that would be a police matter.
Yes, please. Just to add to that, I think it's really important that that it's understood the process for reporting antisocial behaviour as well. So it's really key that when there are incidents that are thought to be antisocial behaviour, they are reported, because it gives the police a context, it gives the kind of understanding of the situation to be able to see what those next steps might be. And that's the point where, you know, we would be working in partnership to, as Joe says, to look at that early intervention, to try and prevent it happening again in the future, and also, you know, the next steps as to whether there is any kind of enforcement action that needs to be taken. But we would always consider trying to work with perpetrators, particularly when you're talking about younger people. We'd try to work with these people beforehand, before it gets to enforcement. But there are tools, and the new bill talks about kind of additional tools to be able to work with people to address enforcement if it's needed.
Thank you.
Councillor Finken.
Thank you. My question really is related to Councillor Rajiv's question. I'm wondering what methods are you using to deal with schools and the responsibility of the education facilities to in the prevention particularly. I mean, I know that the police have fewer resources to put into going into schools, which they used to have, and I wondered whether we are replacing them with the work that you're doing and, you know, liaising with schools to improve the prevention aspect.
So I'll take that one. So our communities team works very closely with the education partnerships, and we sit on those to be able to look at prevention and work together. We also work with the community policing team, so we would go into the schools where we need to, if we think that there's reporting enough to be able to give a context of or understanding of what's happening in the area. So we would go and approach the schools and work with the schools. But again, it's the reporting that gives us the information to identify if there is a need. So it's key that we have that reporting. But we do work with the education partnership.
Councillor Staines, you've been...
Excellent. Two questions, please. One relates to cross Essex systems. So I guess I'm alluding to local government reorganisation, devolution, sharing things, and your ask about how do you collect this data in a meaningful way so it can be shared and that sort of thing. The second point on that one was around, do we know what's worked to stop recurrence? So is there a separate piece that kind of gets bolted on to say, we've got all these great people doing stuff locally, this worked, let's dial it up, this didn't work, let's not repeat that again. So can I start with that one? Is that okay?
Yeah.
So just on your first point about local government reform, obviously we're at very early days and it's very much focused at a really high level. But what we're doing off the back of what Joe's doing and what we will ensure happens with the work that comes out of this scrutiny review is we published today a decision to look to employ somebody to support us in this area. So we've published for the recruitment of an ASB and enforcement manager. And their role will be, as well as picking up the stuff that Joe has looked at, but also being an integral part of how we work towards what the future looks like through LGR. So that's the first question, and Joe's going to pick up the second question.
So your question related to the end of the process when we're gathering and analysing intelligence to prevent the ASB reoccurring in whatever form again. That is an element that the review found is in need of addressing. There is an absence that once an offence has been finished, there is a lack of analysis that provides that 360 look at where, why and how it occurred. So it feeds into our prevention and enforcement service.
Can I add? I think it's also important to note in that space, and there is an absence of it, I think it's important to note that antisocial behaviour is so very individual, and so actually it isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all approach that we know something has worked so we can necessarily carry that forward. But what it does give is us, if we do that piece of work and kind of having identified that gap, is to enable us to provide a kind of a blueprint, a toolkit that we can adapt, which we really want to be able to be in a place to have. And I think that's where, as Charlotte has alluded to, the kind of extra resource is going to be able to help us to do that. But there is never going to be a one-size-fits-all for antisocial behaviour, because it is such an individual kind of system that we're working in, and it is down to people's feelings, behaviours and perceptions as well.
Councillor Ramage.
Oh, hang on.
Thank you for your indulgence, Chair. I was going to mention about schools, but in particular, Councillor Williams and myself attended a community funding event, if you like, at the Mortins Academy in Witham, where they've got some certain individuals there who have gone off track, if you know, and they use this boxing facility, which you know, gets them hopefully back to where they want to be as such, you know, because obviously there's a lot of that goes on in the schools, antisocial behaviour, which presumably the teachers have to keep a handle on, but then it goes outside, doesn't it? And so I think it's imperative that obviously we do liaise with the schools, because that's where a lot of the issues come up, I feel. Could I ask one other question while I've got you? Regarding if an antisocial behaviour process goes through to ultimately they're found guilty of whatever offence, what is the sort of penalties that they get, these individuals? I mean, is it a slap over the wrist or 20 years in jail or what? You know, I mean, it's just I always find sometimes the crime that's committed is not appropriate for whatever the final outcome of it is, if you know what I mean.
You've got two ends of the spectrum there, haven't you?
Yeah.
The slap on the wrist and the 20 years, and ASB fits in the middle of that, but towards the lower end of it. So if there is evidence and the legal burdens are satisfied that ASB has occurred, and it has occurred at the hands of that perpetrator, then the guidance is very clear about what officers can use their powers for. So they can issue community penalty notices. Now that's a civil burden, so they have to prove beyond the bounds of probabilities that that person committed that offence. If that CPN is breached, that becomes a criminal matter and will go to the court. So ASB sits in that space where it's a civil matter and it turns into a criminal matter.
Right.
So it's not a straightforward answer. So we've got community penalty notices, we've got fixed penalty notices if the PSPO is breached, we've got closure orders for dealing with problem premises. There are civil injunctions, and they were, we were talking about earlier, are likely to change for youth injunctions that will come in for the under 18s. So there's a suite of enforcement options they can use. But before they get to that point, and this goes back to the prevention and intervention work, there's also informal powers they can use. So they can issue, along with the police, informal warnings or formal warnings. So it's that step before we start going down the formal process of interventions, of enforcement. So again, it's very much taking each case on its own merits and understanding the causes of it, and then applying appropriate sanction thereafter.
Yeah.
If it spills into a criminal offence, then we can go to 20
I mean,
years.
when you say criminal offence, does that mean something like property damage or something like that as such?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Because obviously, you know, like someone smashing the windscreen of a car or something like that.
Yes. So ASB is predominantly there for dealing with the low level, persistent but low level. However, that doesn't mean that we don't address more high level matters, because often, as Caroline was alluding to, it's the reporting that matters. So people have to be aware of where to report to the right agency. So it's important that if we get a report in, that we don't dismiss that report as just low-level ASB or high-level ASB. We don't pigeonhole it, we assess it, and we make sure that it goes to the right agency, and that we continue to support those agencies in our partnership working to collectively come to the right outcome.
Because in Witham we have specials, and Sergeant Jess is the light, if you like, for all the policing going on in there. And it's important that they have a relationship with yourself, but also with the perpetrators, if you like.
Yes.
And he
Yes.
seems to get the respect of the young children that are running around and causing issues. But yeah, so it's an ongoing thing, obviously, you know, because little ones grow, don't they? You know, and you have
do,
another lot
yeah.
to deal with. And but it's important that also there's a lot of visual sort of that type of thing going around the streets, so they can see that there is somebody about and they're not going to cause any problems. So, but that's not all, because it's all down to resources. I mean, how many people have we got as such to go out and do inquiries and things?
Well, this comes back to the resourcing within the team. So we've got the environmental health team,
Yeah.
and we've got the street scene enforcement team, but they're not exclusive to ASB.
No, that's
so,
right.
So that they are.
So there's a resources problem there in a way.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, very much so. But as Charlotte alluded to, with the new post that's coming in, we would look to create efficiencies within the reporting system so that we make sure that the reports of ASB go to the right people at the right time, so they're dealt with more efficiently.
Also, the report that Joe shared has got some more details about the resources that we have, if you wanted to refer to that at any point as well.
Sorry, wrong ding dong. Councillor Garrett, over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions. So the first is, I mean, I can see that there are methods to protect victims, but seems to be very little support for them. They can't access victim support until it meets the criminal threshold. And I don't think that's very fair, because some of them can be quite traumatised by persistent attacks of whatever description. So I'd like to see really more victim support from the council to be integrated into their policies, whether it be to organisations such as ASB Help, or whether there can be a follow-up integrated. As you've said, you want to look at it holistically, but it would be quite nice if they received a phone call 3 months or 6 months later to just follow up and just to see how things are going. So that's one thing that one recommendation I'd like to be considered by the committee. The second thing is the latest data from the crime survey for England and Wales said that more than a third of people have either experienced or witnessed antisocial behaviour, which is not quite the same as the data you've given us from Stuart, which is fine. There's going to be discrepancies across the country, but with ASB Help, they had last year 396 inquiries, and 63% of those were neighbourhood related, so neighbour related. And I'm just wondering if there is any data or any assistance that can be offered by your department to the planning committee in respect of the local plan and how things are going forward with the development of developments and how certain developments may be a little bit more difficult to live in than others, and the reasons behind that, well, are the walls a little bit too thin? Do people have enough personal space? What sort of things could be changed there to help in that direction? That's something really, I know that's quite a big task, but have you seen that there are certain developments which seem to have more antisocial behaviour problems than other? I don't expect you to name them, but are there certain ones, and are they older developments or are they newer developments? That's what I'm interested in.
So, in terms of the first point you raised, it's very much in keeping with the views of the Victims Commissioner, and you're right in what you say, that currently offences have to, or actions have to reach a criminal standard before victims have access to the victim support services. There is currently the Victim and Prisoners Act, which has got the power within it to change that. So government is due to go out, I believe, to consult on making changes to that, so that the victims of ASB would then be entitled to support from victim services. So we're very much on a national level waiting for the government to implement that. But I do recognise your point on a local level. that we do need to do more to support victims and identify victims when they come in and treat them on a more individual basis. So yes, that was part of the findings and is part of the recommendations that I will make.
So just to add, I'll move on to the development side in a little bit, but just to add to that in terms of the local kind of approach to supporting victims, I think that the report has identified that actually we don't have within the authority a huge amount of resource that is focused on casework and intervention casework and support for victims. And that's one of the things that, in terms of those that you've talked about, follow-up phone calls and giving that kind of greater care, it's a resource-intensive approach, which absolutely doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, but I think I just want to acknowledge that we haven't had that resource to do that, which is why the report has identified a need for increased resource. So we will have somebody in to look at all of that.
Are there any
forward.
charities that might consider taking that on board, do you think?
There are a number of
Partners.
charities, and I think that will be part of this role, this new role, to look at what's out there, look at how we can kind of implement those processes and kind of tighten up that approach a little more. So I'm moving on to your question about the development side of things. Obviously, I'm not kind of from the planning team, but in terms of how the conversations have been happening recently with the planning team, we do want to be much more involved from early doors around developments that are coming about, to be able to talk with the police and design out crime officers at the police, to be able to look at pockets of antisocial behaviour, criminality, and whether these are the right kind of developments. So there are discussions happening about how we do that going forward. I think it's fair to say that antisocial behaviour moves in waves, and I think that there are probably areas and developments where there is more antisocial behaviour at any one time, but I don't think we can pinpoint and say particularly one development consistently has more than another. I think it does move around in waves, and again we've talked about the perception of the people who are reporting the antisocial behaviour, so it is very much about how the victims themselves feel and if they feel that it's antisocial behaviour.
Thank you. Yes, what I'm interested in is whether or not developments can be reorganised to make life a little bit easier for those who live in them, and whether there is a discussion between your department and the planning department, and whether this can be conveyed to developers in such a way that it facilitates change.
So in response to that, it's definitely something that's kind of on the agenda to be talking about, and I think that this new role is part of that coordination piece across not just external partnerships but internal. Myself and Charlotte have talked about this quite consistently, about how we can kind of talk better across the organisation to, as you say, work to alleviate some of those crunch points. So that's definitely something that's on the agenda that we know that we need to work towards a little bit more.
That's very good. I'm very pleased that you're speaking to Charlotte about that, because I am quite concerned about the number of bins that are going to be there going forward with the waste review. And I think that may be a source of arguments between neighbours when somebody puts their bin onto their part of their property, because there will be so many bins. So I'm really pleased that you're having those conversations now. Thank you.
Councillor Jeffries.
Thank you. There are a number of things. One of the things that you were just saying about the developments, where I've had problems with neighbours, it tends to be maybe a different, as you say, different perception. So you've got some older residents are being annoyed, if you like, by some younger ones, not necessarily children, but and you're never going to be able to plan that out, because some of those people have lived in those properties all their lives, and then perhaps somebody else moves in, or I've got somewhere people have been there a long while, and then there are children have moved in, and they're perceived as being a nuisance, but other people might just say it's children playing. So there are a lot of different perceptions. I was also going to mention the boxing club. Is that the one at Rain?
No.
Oh, right, because there's
No,
the
this is at the school academy.
there is Rain Boxing and Active Essex. There are a lot of sort of voluntary charities that do work to try and help young people, and it's not always. A lot of the young people have been excluded from school, and sometimes are victims themselves of abuse and things. And I've been talking to a couple of people that are trying to help some of those people. And again, it's a resource thing, particularly when it's outside the sort of normal school funding, that they have a real problem with funding to just try and help, particularly with county lines and things like that, keeping people out of trouble as much as possible. But I guess my real question was, with the PSPOs, I just wonder whether that's actually reduced the number of complaints, not necessarily the actual orders that you've issued, but just generally whether that's had a lowering of complaints in the town.
So I think it's quite early to say with the public space protection order, but I do think I can say that, you know, we think that there is a little less talk around there being issues, but I think it's early to say in terms of categorically giving you data, but it is something that we are monitoring. So I think we should be able to do some feedback on the public space protection order very soon. Just kind of going back to the point about young people and some of the things that we've talked about, and actually I think going back to Councillor Staines' point about understanding where things have worked well, I think I probably am just going to step back to that and I think we did ourselves a little injustice there actually, because when I think about some of the work that's taken place around the Safer Streets projects, where we've applied for funding to the Home Office around pockets of areas in Witham and Halstead. Those bids have included things like getting funding for our leisure centres to provide diversionary activities for young people, to divert them away from crime. So there has been quite a lot of work that we've done, and that has worked and has been positive. What I would say again is this comes down to reporting. So those hotspots have been identified because of reporting. So we know the data's there to identify those are the areas we need to do some targeted intervention. It all comes back to being able to have that kind of context and that information. But we definitely have got some positive work that's kind of taken place that we can carry forward, but we wouldn't be able to do that on a large scale unless we understand the kind of reporting, the complexity and what landscape we're working in. So it does come back to that reporting every time.
Sorry, Councillor Staines.
Question on partnership working, and I'm particularly thinking here about antisocial motor use. So this is donuts in car parks, racing up and down the A131 along Great Leys, around Great Notley, back to McDonald's, and then off again. And I know it's in waves, so if Southend shuts an area down, it might pop up somewhere else. What are we doing? Because I know we've had a number of issues where we've put effectively exclusion orders around an area to break up or enable the police to break up stuff, and the police go away and they come back. They're all waiting on their phones, waiting to come in and do the whatever they're doing. Is there anything that we can do as a group to be more visible to residents that are fed up? For years this has been going on. So first question is, what can we do as a group to look like this, to be more joined up? Is it people in the car park as well as the police driving around? I don't know. Is it some design aspects that Councillor Garrett was talking about? And then the last one was around the retro designing out of issues to make these areas less attractive for antisocial stuff. I know it's a big topic and a big issue. Just keen to hear what you think on that. Thank
Firstly, Chair, can I apologise for being late? I was in another meeting. So, Councillor Sains, thanks for the question. It is something we're actively looking at the moment. So, we're alongside all of our community safety partners, but particularly us and the police, we look at a range of different tools that are available to us to use. So, you've talked about the dispersal orders, and we have used dispersal orders and may use them. They're a temporary fix. But we are looking actively at the moment about what we could use in terms of long-term tools. So that could include a public space protection order. There are other tools that are available to us as well. We're literally actively exploring, and I think you will probably see some information coming through in the next couple of months on that.
Excellent, thank you.
Could I just add to that as well? Just to add, interestingly, the new bill that's we've heard about today actually gives additional powers to the police to seize vehicles without giving warning if it's used for antisocial, if they're being used for antisocial behaviour. So there is kind of additional powers that are being added to that toolkit.
And you know, the design thing is a really important point. So we will work with we can do things to try and deter things from happening whilst they're happening or prevent them. But actually, the best way to prevent them is to design them out of whatever situation they're in. So and that could be around how car parks are designed and how open spaces are designed. Obviously, the highway is the highway, so that's a slightly different thing. So we will give advice, as will the police, to any venue owner or a car park or shop owner that is struggling, not just about what we can do to help them, but what they can do to help themselves as well to prevent that from happening.
Excellent. Good.
Councillor Garrett.
Thank you, Chair. So we've got a number of partners that you work with in the Community Safety Partnership, and no doubt they all have their own policies, which hopefully link to legislation. I just wondered if there's any way of that Braintree Council actually integrates with some of those policies, and how you can work together more with the policies that are published, because this is all about policy and those which are going forward. What I'm concerned about is that sometimes people have their own policies and they don't always integrate. And I just wondered if the Community Safety Partnership has a policy of its own, so working together, or whether they just go off individually and work to their own policies.
So the Community Safety Partnership has terms and conditions. I wouldn't say it necessarily has a policy per se around antisocial behaviour, but it has terms and conditions about how we work together. In terms of individual policies, part of the resource that we've talked about today will be able to map some of those policies and do a little bit more of a coordinating approach. What I would say is, for example, we have many different kind of forums, multi-agency approaches. So we have a registered providers forum, and one of the themes that we talk about the registered providers with the housing registered providers is their antisocial behaviour policies and approach, so that we can look at best practice and share that best practice to try and improve how things are working. So there's definitely a role that Braintree District Council has in terms of coordinating, and the Community Safety Partnership has in terms of coordinating those policies, but it's something we want to improve on.
It's probably worth clocking that we do have a joint strategy. So the strategy is joint for the Community Safety Partnership, and then we have an annual action plan that is set to deliver that. So we have agreed priorities across those partners, and then each partner links whatever they're doing in terms of policy to that strategy and the action plan where it's relevant, obviously.
One thing I have picked up on with Eastlight in particular, there seems to be difficulty in actually who handles complaints. Tracy Parry said that the first port of call should always be to the housing provider, which may or may not be Eastlight, and Josie said that they were always happy to accept complaints. It would be quite nice to know if councillors have access to the policies that Eastlight provide for themselves, to see how things can be, well, if we can look at those policies and see if anything can be gleaned from that. Is that something that is open to councillors, or is that a private policy for Eastlight?
I think if the policies are published, then you can have access to them. I think in terms of the scope of the policy review for this committee, I would say partly what we're looking at, and if you've talked about the ASB and enforcement resource.
Yes.
Brilliant. Very excited. So that role, what we're hoping to do is help to inform and give confidence to registered providers to enable them to enact those policies. So, but by all means, I'm sure their policies will be on their website. So feel free to have a look. If they're available to us or to you, they will be published on their website. If not, they're likely to be private policies. But aside from that, just in terms of how they handle ASB, our support will be about how can we use best practice, how can you use best practice, how can we support you to do that and give you the confidence to use the tools that are at your disposal. So it will be more our role as an organisation will be more around providing support and training where they would like it, because it's their responsibility. If they don't want it, that's down to them, but if they would like support and education or even networking and advice, then we're more than happy to give that to them. And we do already, I think, particularly in the Charlotte Street Scene Enforcement team, liaising with ASB teams in housing with registered providers on a regular basis.
Just very briefly, Chair, sorry, with your indulgence. One particular area of ASB that I find often reaches a dead end is when a vehicle is parked either on a highway or on a lay-by and it's been left sort of abandoned. You know, the tyres are a bit flat and it's starting to go a bit rusty and the MOT's run out and it's not taxed. And I often find that when a housing provider is also involved, there's very little they can do, and often the DVLA don't respond. How does Braintree Council handle that sort of problem? Because I've had, seen vehicles that have been left there for years and are still there.
Yes, so I think it does depend on the land in which it's abandoned, and sometimes the landlords, they own the land themselves, so it doesn't fall within the same jurisdiction. We do have a policy and a procedure that we follow with abandoned vehicles, and sometimes whilst they might look abandoned, it depends on what's going on through our processes to check where they are through the DVLA. So I've not heard of any reasons when they haven't responded to us, but we do go through those processes and speak to the owners, and where they don't deal with it, then they are removed.
Councillor Staines, are you winking at me, or would you like to speak? Far away.
There was a thing on the BBC, and it looked horrendous. It really did look very, very ugly. Big tower, lots of things on it, cameras, microphones, and it was used to enforce against a noisy motorbike. Now, representing Finchinfield, we get a lot of bikes through. Most of them are fantastic, drink lots of coffee, have a beer or two, and then drive off into the sunset, no problem at all. There are some that spoil weekends for our residents every single weekend. Are we thinking about any sort of technological leaps forward or adopting best practice that's we've seen elsewhere to help us nip some of this stuff in the bud? Please.
So I think in terms of that you, I'm sure you'll be aware, Councillor Staines, that the roads policing team take a lead on responding to that. I'm not aware of any statutory noise nuisance complaints, but I wouldn't necessarily be. I can check with the environmental health team. It tends to be dealt with through the roads policing team. I am aware that they have a number of different technologies at their disposal, but I wouldn't be able to tell you what they are off the top of my head. Sorry.
Thank you. Members, before we bring the Q&A session to a close, are there any additional lines of inquiry that you wish to raise with the officers in respect of the report and information received this evening, having regard to the terms of reference of the scrutiny review?
Chairman, would it be helpful if I read through the terms of reference just to remind
Yes,
members
why not?
of what questions we just need to make sure we answer as part of the scrutiny review.
Please do.
Okay. So, members, the key lines of inquiry that we have, so we're looking at what is the role of the council in relation to ASB. I feel like we have covered that. Who else is responsible for matters relating to ASB outside of the council? So we've looked at some of the partners that we work with. What enforcement powers does the council have to resolve ASB issues, and what are the subsequent routes it would follow? So we have touched on enforcement. We've had officers come along and inform us on that. And then obviously what processes and policies does the council currently have in place, and are they effective, are they adequate? So that's what we really need to be focusing on as part of our lines of questioning. And then also, to what extent does the council comply with these policies, and how could this be proven if required, for example, to the Ombudsman? And then finally, what else could the council do in future to support, encourage others in terms of developing other ASB interventions? So I just thought it'd be helpful just to read that out and just remind you of exactly what questions we're looking to cover as part of our scrutiny review. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess. Thank you all. We've made a note of the information received from the presentation. Thank you to Joe, Charlotte and Caroline for your attendance and the information provided this evening. You are all welcome to stay for the remainder of the meeting, but please feel free to leave the meeting now if you so wish.
Councillor Garrett did mention about a recommendation about strengthening victim support. Should we say anything about that, or were you just...
Just to confirm, members, I have been keeping a note of where we've mentioned anything like that, but there is a section
Yes.
next about discussing any recommendations we might have or ideas. So, yeah, not a problem. We've kept a note.
Sorry. We need to consider whether we have any recommendations we would like to make as a result of our scrutiny review. Are we as a committee satisfied that we've answered all the questions within the terms of reference, which Jess has just read to us, or do we feel that there are further lines of inquiry that we should pursue? I'd like us to give this consideration following this evening. However, if members do have any suggestions now, I'd welcome the discussion. Members?
Well, clearly the victim support and working with charities, perhaps directing people to charities on the website might be useful. There are quite a few, but ASB Help is obviously one of them. So that's the first thing that I would like considered. Yeah, I'll leave it there, but...
Anyone else got any thoughts? Councillor Ramage.
Yeah, I think there's one thing which concerns me as far as is resources. And I feel that perhaps we ought to review whether we need to have more resources for our duty as what we're doing here as a council. Because obviously you can only stretch yourself so far. And then, you know, you're missing people that need help. So that's just my thoughts. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Garrett.
I knew there was one more here somewhere. So over the 3 areas that are covered, I wondered if it might be prudent to have one individual officer who oversees all 3, so that there is a discussion being had. Well, if they can oversee all the 3 areas, I think that would be a lot easier. Sherry, you have something to say?
So, members, hot off the press, I can make you aware, I thought you'd picked that up already, but perhaps in a little bit more detail. I can say it now because I've published the delegated decision this evening, that I have got agreement and funding for a 2-year fixed term post to implement the outcomes of the ASB review that Joe has undertaken for us, and take responsibility for ASB for the organisation. So, not that I was psychic or anything, Councillor Garrett, but to look after ASB across the whole organisation. So, particularly looking at how we coordinate across the 3 areas. Also taking line management responsibility for the street scene enforcement team, who deal with the biggest volume of ASB cases, and look at doing some further work for us around early intervention, in ASB, so how we can prevent things from getting to a point where there has to be an enforcement case. But also I'm commissioning a piece of work around enforcement that has come out of that ASB review, which this post will also support. So, that's literally been decided today. So members, you wouldn't have seen that because it was only published this afternoon.
Okay, that's really useful. Sorry, Chair, just one more thing about about legislation. So it's very difficult to know. So I feel like we're in the middle of something where we're not completing it because we don't actually know what the new legislation is. So what are the plans going forward so that are we going to see the new legislation or are we just going to recommend on what we have presently?
I don't know.
Can I just be clear, it's not legislation yet, so we've got a bill at the moment, so it will take quite a long time to go through and may not look the same as it does now when it gets to the other end of it. So what we have got is resources in place both through this role but also the 3 heads of service in my directorate that have collective responsibility around this, who are going to be looking at what the impact of that legislation could be. We can do some prep now, but as with other pieces of legislation like the Protect legislation, we need to wait to see a little bit more about what that's going to look like to understand how it might impact us and the work that we do. So we'll keep a really close eye on the progress of the bill, and I can commit to that to you this evening. And then once we're a little clearer on what that's going to turn into when it becomes an act, we can then look at what we need to change, add, remove as a result of that legislation coming through.
I would like to make a recommendation, as everyone else has made that. Representing a rural constituency, I think it would be very useful if we were made, or the general public were made more aware of exactly what antisocial behaviour is and how you complain about it, because people using chainsaws on a Sunday morning or driving motorbikes over footpaths or crazy barking dogs or cocks crowing, I mean, farm machinery or alarms going off, they tend to call parish councillors or district councillors or the police, and they're basically told to forget it. And I think if they actually realised it was an ASB and someone, there might be something in between. But they don't realise that, and I think the fact that it's antisocial, the rural parts of my wards are very loosely populated, and some poor person being driven mad by someone driving their sort of all-terrain vehicle at the crack of dawn doesn't really know who to go to, and it seems clear from this evening that they should come to the district council, because the police do nothing, and the parish councillors get in a panic and say it's not their remit. So I think there should be more publicity about ASBs, and whether, I mean, how that's done, I don't know. I mean, we have sort of a communications team, but I am absolutely certain that people are very unaware of the scope of what you guys all do. Yeah, of course, Jess.
So thank you everyone who has, thank you Chair, and thank you everyone who has put some recommendations forward. Obviously these would just be in draft form at the moment, but what I would just say is when you're putting recommendations forward is just to make sure we've got the evidence to back it up as well. So just so when it comes to formalising it into a report to the Cabinet, we have that alongside it to back it up. So from the policy side of things that we've been looking at, what from those policies kind of suggests that we might need these, these recommendations to come forward. So just to be conscious of that really is all I mean.
Could I just echo what you've said? I think as a former parish councillor for donkey's years, they do come to parish councils quite a lot for advice. It would be really nice if there could be a paper, a description of what antisocial behaviour is, and simplistically how people can deal with that, so that parish councils can publish that on their website and feed it out as they see necessary. Because often with new parish councils they change quite often as well, and they don't always have that information to hand. So if there was just one A4 sheet I know it's going to be very difficult to get that on one A4 sheet, but to feed that out to parish councillors so that they can then send it to people who make inquiries. I know they can direct them to the website, but not everybody, some of the older people, etc., can't always navigate around websites. And it'd be really nice if parish councillors had that information. Really good recommendation, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Garrett. Me or Jessica directly. I'm sorry, I'm bewildered by my own funny little machine. We will now proceed with item 6, work programme of the committee for 2024-25. Members, the report for this item is set on pages 6 to 13 of your agendas. The purpose of the report this evening is to provide a summary of the committee's progress in accordance with its work programme for 24-25, a copy of which is provided at Appendix 1. A revised copy of the work programme was circulated to members via email yesterday. Please note that the committee's next meeting on the 9th of April 2025 will be used to review the waste review policy. There have been no other substantial changes made to the work programme. Do members have any questions in respect of the committee's work programme for 2024-25? Thank you, members. We are asked to note the work programme of the Corporate Policy Development Committee for 2024-25. Can I take it that the report has been noted? Please raise your hands. Thank you, members. The report has been noted. Members, this item concludes our business for this evening. As mentioned previously, the next scheduled meeting of the Corporate Policy Development Committee is due to take place on Wednesday, the 9th of April 2025. I'd be grateful if members could ensure they keep a note of this date and notify the governance team accordingly if they intend to give their apologies. I'd like to thank all those who watched the meeting this evening online. I will now close this meeting of the Corporate Policy Development Committee at 8:27. Thank you for your attendance. Have a lovely evening.